My name is Deb Van Dynen. I'm an Associate Professor of English Education at Hope College, and I have the honor of being the NEA Big Read and Little Read Lakeshore Director. The NEA Big Read Lakeshore and Little Read Lakeshore programs are month-long community-wide reading programs focused on the reading of a common book. This year, because of COVID, we've switched to a mostly virtual program. We're excited for the possibilities that this presents us as we can expand our audience's scope and reach, as well as our ability to connect with speakers and experts that are beyond our geographical reach. Thank you for joining us this year as we explore Nathaniel Philbrick's In the Heart of the Sea and Marcia Diane Arnold's Galapagos Girl Galapagos. We hope you enjoy these events and learn lots about the book's topics and themes, as well as issues and important questions in our world today.
Hi, I'm Daniel Elias. I'm a museum curator and educator with a specialty in cross-cultural programs. I have Scots English and Eastern European Jewish backgrounds, and I've lived most of my life in Massachusetts. I want to acknowledge that we're talking today about lands that have been stewarded through the millennia by the Massachusetts people, the Nauset people, and the Wampanoag people. And I also send my respects to the Potawatomi people of the eastern shore of Lake Michigan. Additionally, I want to thank Deborah Van Dienen, Abby Knoner, and Kaylee McKee, I hope I'm pronouncing them right, of the Lakeshore Big Read for their support in preparing this talk. They're great. It's really been fun to work with them. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk about the context of race on Nantucket through the centuries. You've read Philbrick's book. You know that relations between Black and white people were somewhat different on Nantucket than they were elsewhere, and we'll explore some of those complexities. I should preface my remarks by saying that my perspective is undoubtedly skewed by my experience. Please let me know in the question period if I stray too far into my own preconceptions. Here's the takeaway about cultural attitudes about race on Nantucket. It's complicated. It's always been complicated. Race is a cultural construct, not a genetic fact. Yet it has forceful impacts on all of us, including the men at the heart of this book. Nat Philbrick illustrates clearly the challenges that Black sailors faced in the whaleboats of the Essex. He's done the research to understand and describe the different conditions under which sailors of color lived compared with white sailors, and especially with white Nantucketers. He also acknowledges that white chroniclers of the story avoided a direct discussion of the effects of race, and that their accounts are less than complete as a result. The talk today is to add some detail about Nantucket life in regards to the cultural construct of race. The four main points we'll cover in historical order. First, history of the cultural groups on Nantucket. Second, the financial structure of whaling, how it rewarded sailors, officers, captains, owners, and agents. Third, I'd like to talk a little bit about Black sailors and Black officers. There were lots of Black sailors, there were fewer Black officers, and there were a number of Black captains, not very many, but some interesting folks. We'll meet them. Finally, I'd like to give you a look at some of the people and some of the major events that shaped attitudes about race on Nantucket, both before and after the sinking of the Essex. Initially, beginning before the glaciers melted, the waters rose and created the island of Nantucket, indigenous people were the sole inhabitants. They were individuals with names and histories, skilled in creating tools, homes, and stories of their own design, and in learning new stories and techniques from their counterparts on the mainland. By the 17th century, when English colonists began to arrive in the neighborhood, there were two distinct bands of indigenous people on the island, living quite separate lifestyles. The eastern end of the island had more game and better soil, and its people were generally tall and healthy. The western end of the island was populated by gatherers of fish and shellfish who were less well-fed, shorter, and survived on thinner resources. There were conflicts between these two groups and among factions within each, as well as contact with white people from nearby Martha's Vineyard and probably from the mainland as well. Descendants of this community still lived nearby, although indigenous heritage on Nantucket is fairly rare, and they call themselves the Wampanoag people today. With the arrival of the English colonists on Nantucket in 1659, and even prior to that moment, change was probably inevitable, and the indigenous owners of Nantucket began to come under stress. The first group of Englishmen who moved to the island called themselves the proprietors, depicted as Stephen Greenleaf, who was a grandson of one of the original group. They brought with them wives, children, and this is Mary Gardner Coffin, who was third generation and lived in this house, the oldest house currently in its original location on Nantucket. They brought sheep, cows, and pretty soon enslaved African people. English farming practices, poorly calibrated to local conditions, depleted the already marginal soil, grazed animals year-round, shut the Wampanoags out of large tracts of fertile land. Indigenous people began to starve, and with the introduction of disease, alcohol, Christianity, and English expectations of behavior and punishment, the local people were in many cases reduced to debt servitude, creating a laboring class that supported the unsustainable English lifestyle with free or inexpensive labor. Since the island's resources were insufficient to support them, the English turned to trade for sustenance. They needed a resource to trade with, and eventually, with a great deal of help from the locals who had been harvesting drift whales washed up on shore for centuries, discovered whale oil, a commodity they had a natural advantage in taking due to their location far out in the Atlantic and their related experience with boats and ships of all kinds. The English on Nantucket in the 17th century were not particularly religious. They resisted installing a permanent minister or building a church. One of the reasons they left northern Massachusetts was to flee religious intolerance. They weren't quick to reinstitute it. The cultural groups on the island then at about 1700 were, broadly speaking, the indigenous people, the English and other European settlers, and enslaved people brought to America by force, Africans. The English values of Christian cultural domination and market economy were supported by their monopoly ownership of firearms, the legal and bureaucratic systems, advanced marine and metals technology, global trade networks, and a rapacious desire backed up by highly developed tools for financial gain and capital development in service of control of all the other cultural groups. By the mid-18th century, Wampanoag presence on the island was less than a fifth of what it had been a century earlier. A mysterious illness that affected the Indians but left the English unscathed swept through in 1769 and halved the already fragmented population. Although there are people on Nantucket, in Cape Cod, and elsewhere that have Nantucket Wampanoag heritage, with the death of Abram Quarry and Dorcas Honorable, two Wampanoag people living on the island in the 19th century and shown here, Wampanoag culture had effectively vanished from Nantucket by the end of the 19th century. This is the headstone of P. Jomo, an indigenous person who died on Nantucket in 1731. Into this mix in 1701 or thereabouts came the Quaker religion in the form of John Richardson, a preacher invited to the island by merchant and political leader Mary Coffin Starbuck. She converted much of the island to Quakerism and helped shape the character of the island for more than a century. Quakers eschewed ostentation and religious organization, preferring a direct relationship with God and a simple way of life. Many Quakers, and Nantucketers most of all, were focused on wealth using all the energy and passion reserved for war and battle in other cultures in the pursuit of profit. While they were and are still opposed to violence for political ends, they were iron-willed when it came to ensuring Quaker owners' profits from whaling voyages came before the comfort or safety of the men that killed and butchered the whales on the open sea in all conditions to fill their barrels with whale oil. The Nantucket Quakers didn't believe, in theory at least, in slavery. In 1710, William Gayer, an old man preparing his will, gave freedom and property to Africa, a Negro once my servant, and to Patience Poot, his housekeeper, who was likely a Wampanoag woman, in line with an injunction in Deuteronomy 15 that if someone serves you for 6 years, then in the 7th year you shall let him go free from you, and you shall supply him liberally from your flock and threshing floor and winepress. In 1716, Nantucket Quakers were one of the first congregations in New England to state publicly their opposition to lifetime chattel slavery. In 1729 and 30, Elihu Coleman, a preacher and a carpenter on the island, he made and owned the desk shown here, wrote a tract listing the scriptural pronouncements that, in his view, made slaveholding anti-Christian. The tract was published in 1733, making it one of the earliest public writings against slavery in all of New England. And yet, when the new state of Massachusetts, which had been the first colony to give legal sanction to bond slavery, finally accepted the ruling of the courts in 1783 that wages were due to enslaved people, effectively ending slavery, there were still many on Nantucket, including Gayer's own grandson, that held people in bondage. The Quaker religion remained dominant on Nantucket through about 1830 and was still powerful, but diminished in power from then through the end of the, say, 19th century. Philbrick notes that many of the owners, captains, and officers of whale ships were drawn from a close-knit, interrelated, largely Quaker community, which included Nantucketers as well as their cousins and colleagues in New Bedford and elsewhere. They were essentially all white, although there are a few notable exceptions we'll hear about later, and they turned to each other for help and to offer opportunity both on shore and at sea, keeping profits and control tightly held within the circle. Agents were the core of the whaling business. Frequently, former captains, such as the Essex owner, Gideon Folger, they acted in the role of venture capitalists, matching ships and captains, giving guidance as to where and how to hunt whales, and of what type. They also recruited investors who purchased shares of a voyage's profits and were able to diversify their investments across multiple voyages while providing the capital necessary to outfit a whaling ship for voyages to the far side of the earth, often lasting 3 to 5 years. Finally, the agents procured insurance against the loss of ship or the loss of cargo. The lay system was an interesting American twist on sailors' compensation packages. British whalers were paid a monthly wage. American whalers, on the other hand, were paid only at the end of a voyage and only as a percentage of the total proceeds of the sale of the oil they had brought back. The prospect of individual effort making a significant difference in pay provided a strong incentive to work harder, stay out longer, and bring more oil back. This difference, together with the Quaker love of profit and allergy to expense, made the American whaling industry far and away more profitable than the passive, state-subsidized English version. Occasionally, individual sailors were even able to make themselves pretty wealthy if their voyages paid off handsomely. In general, however, it was a pretty dangerous, low-paying, difficult, and lonely job that many people really signed up for only once. Countering the clubby nature of investor and agent groups, the challenging work environment of whalemen, the famous toleration of gender and racial difference of Quakers, meant that, for ordinary seamen at least, merit was given weight in choosing men for advancement. Death and desertion were pretty common during voyages. See Henry DeWitt's departure in South America in the Philbrick book. And sailors and green hands were recruited in ports far removed from Nantucket, occasionally bringing people of color into positions of importance on the whaling ship. Some of these actually returned to Nantucket to claim their lay a portion of the profits of the voyage. Unlike many shoreside professions, whalers were valued for their skills and promoted during voyages to fill voids in the roster of sailors and of officers. So the two forces worked in complicated ways, with the net result that black and brown men occasionally took positions of responsibility, often up to boat steerer, and occasionally earned substantial financial rewards, but stopped short, usually, of a mate's berth. So Philbrick notes that most officers and almost all captains were white, and that Nantucketers were promoted above all others. While true in a general way, there were notable exceptions. Black sailors were common, as on the Essex, and were a significant element in black communities, as they were always traveling, and they could bring news from one community to another. They really occupied a different status from black people on shore. On ships, rank was more important than race, and a man's experience and character were prime determinants of how much he got paid. As one looks higher on the registry to the boat steerers and mates, the numbers do come down, but circumstances and ability caused many African and African American men to be named officers. The nature of shipboard life meant that the sailors, and especially the whalers' life, was a good one for those who were escaping slavery. Whalers were away from the United States for long periods of time, evading detection and capture. They were vouched for by their captains when they put into a port as to their identity and origins, and many northern captains were happy to supply cover to a good hand rather than give him up to a slave catcher. The Seamen's Acts that allowed Southern states to capture any black sailors, free or formerly enslaved, were difficult to enforce, as the boom in cotton after development of Whitney's cotton gin meant they needed consistent shipping to realize profits, which proved more important than capturing runaways or making slaves of free black sailors. In the 1980s, Martha Putney wrote a groundbreaking study of shipping documents looking for African American sailors and officers, called Black Sailors, Afro-American Merchant Seamen and Whalemen Prior to the Civil War. In it, she identified nearly 1,000 sailors, and Skip Finley, in the recently published Whaling Captains of Color, America's First Meritocracy, identifies 67 individual African heritage men who achieved a captain's commission, the highest rank of seamanship. There were undoubtedly more than these few, but out of the thousands and thousands of sailors and the hundreds and hundreds of captains, it was still a small number. Paul Cuffey was one of the unusual ones. Born on the nearby island of Cuttyhunk, he was the child of Kofi Slocum, a formerly enslaved African man, and Ruth Moses, a Wampanoag woman. As a teenager during the American Revolution, Paul braved pirates, privateers, and naval blockades to bring urgently needed supplies to Nantucket, developing close relationships there with business and religious leaders. His bravery, ability as a sailor, drive, and intelligence in business allowed him to build a shipping and shipbuilding empire at Dartmouth, Mass., employing mainly African and African American sailors and officers. His brothers and brothers-in-law became captains in their own right. William Roach of Nantucket, a wealthy merchant, helped him to join the Dartmouth Quaker meeting. Absalom Boston of Nantucket skippered the industry, putting together an all-African-American whaling crew in 1822, the first person to do so. He was a member of one of the most important African heritage families on Nantucket. His grandfather, simply named Boston, was enslaved, owned by the Swain family. His uncle Prince Boston, born enslaved to the Swains as well, was sent on a whaling voyage, came home, and was paid a lay for his service. The Swain family sued the captain of the ship for having paid Prince, but lost in court, an early example of the Massachusetts courts' growing opposition to slavery that ultimately made the institution obsolete by 1783. Absalom became a mariner, rising to captain before retiring from the sea to become a landside innkeeper and successful business person. Absalom's friend Edward J. Pompey, also a Nantucketer, also became a captain and businessman and a major force in the drive for abolition and equality. He became Nantucket's agent for William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator. This letter from Garrison to Pompey is in the collection of the Nantucket Historical Association. Boston and Pompey were pivotal in the construction of the African Meeting House, which housed both the African Baptist Church and eventually the African School, where James Crawford, also an escaped slave, was for many years the pastor and a pivotal member of Nantucket's African heritage community. One thing about history, the closer you look, the fuzzier it gets. The world was just as complicated then as it is now, just at a different rate of speed. While it's tempting to say Nantucket was in favor of abolition or Nantucket was on the side of the Crown in the Revolution, when you look closely into the letters and statements made at the time and you draw out a timeline of events, it's clear that there was lots of disagreement and splintering of political positions. Nantucket was home to individuals, both white and black, that stand out in U.S. history as activists advocating for black equality, for women's equality, and for the toleration of difference. Some, like Nathaniel and Eliza Starbuck Barney and Phoebe Hannaford, fought hard and gave money for abolition of slavery, a smaller number for a broad equality of opportunity in terms of housing, wealth, medical care, education, voting suffrage, and a host of other dimensions, along which people of color and women fared worse than the white men. It's an unfortunate fact that we have far more documentation in the collection of white allies, such as the Barneys and Phoebe Hannaford, than we do of African heritage activists like Pompey and Boston. A large number, though, even among Quakers, opposed integration and equality of opportunity. Nationally, abolitionists were regarded by white politicians and ministers as agitators and firebrands, and were regarded with suspicion by the large majority of white people. I'd like to tell you some stories to illustrate some of the issues at the time of the Essex disaster and after, and point out some of the people who struggled hardest to make the relationship between the races better. Arthur Cooper escaped slavery in Virginia and fled to the north in about 1820, just as the Essex was going to sea. He and his wife, who may have been an escaped slave, or she may have been a freeborn woman from Massachusetts, made a home in the neighborhood called New Guinea, founded in the last years of the 18th century and home to people of African, Pacific, and Cape Verdean ancestry, among others. In 1822, slave hunters from Virginia arrived looking for Cooper, intending to capture him and his family and return them all to slavery, in accordance with the Fugitive Slave Act passed in the 1790s. Neighbors, first those of color living nearby, followed by white residents from the neighborhood just up Pleasant Street, remonstrated with the marshals, eventually threatening to detain them and saying there was no validity to their paperwork in Massachusetts. The whole family was hustled out the back door of the house, while the argument was taking place and hidden in several houses of white neighbors until the marshals left the island some days later. One of the houses in which they sheltered was owned by Oliver and Hannah Macy Gardner, whose daughter Anna was only 6 years old. She retained the memory all her life and became a leader in the white community for universal suffrage to include both Black and female people. As a 15-year-old, she opened an elementary school in which all races were welcomed. And at 18, she became the sole teacher of some 50 students in the African school, held in the recently built African Meeting House located in New Guinea. In 1840, Anna Gardner encouraged her star pupil Eunice Ross to sit for the exams to enter the newly built high school. She passed with flying colors, but she was refused admittance on account of her color, as Eunice wrote later. This was perhaps the most consequential event regarding the relationships of race in Nantucket history. These events demonstrate how thoroughly divided Nantucket was on the question of integration. In a protest to the town's refusal to seat Eunice Ross as a 9th grade student, Anna Gardner left her job at the African school, was kicked out of the Quaker faith, and took a new position as the secretary of the newly formed Nantucket Anti-Slavery Society. As secretary of the society, Anna participated in creating the first annual convention of the society in 1841. At the convention, an escaped slave spoke about the trials he had endured as a slave and in escaping to New Bedford and making a life in the marine trades. His name was Frederick Douglass, and the speech he gave that night was his first to an audience that included white people. He remembered that event as terrifying, but the audience was riveted. Later that night, William Lloyd Garrison and John A. Collins, leaders of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, offered Douglass a job on the spot, lecturing on the evils of slavery. The Nantucket Anti-Slavery Association went on to organize a convention the next year as well, and invited Garrison and Douglass back again. Also on the roster that year was Stephen S. Foster, a former minister from New Hampshire who became a fiery speaker for abolition, especially calling out the role of all the major churches in the U.S. in abetting and providing theological cover for slaveholding. His rhetoric was so strong, calling religious authorities a brotherhood of thieves, whoremongers, man-stealers, that he had frequently been heckled, threatened, harassed, and even stoned by mobs protesting his speeches. It happened again in 1842, as Nantucket was hotly debating the school desegregation issue, and with the specter of black-white marriage called amalgamation at the core. The night after Foster's speech to the convention, it was interrupted by an angry mob hurling rotten food and stones, not only at the speakers, but at the audience of black and white, male and female, young and old as well. The riot caused the convention to leave the halls of the Atheneum, which told the organizers that they would be responsible for the damages caused by the mob. And eventually they landed at the Big Shop, a shipbuilding facility near the wharves, and finally ended the convention a day early. The island continued to fight about the question of black education, with the school committee voting one way, being overruled by the town, then switching sides as new elections took place, and back and forth continually for 5 long years. In 1845, Edward J. Pompey and Absalom Boston, black whaling captains and businessmen, submitted a petition with signatures of 105 Nantucket residents of color to the Massachusetts legislature, asking for a law to guarantee access to all schools for all children. White supporters added their own petitions as well, as did Eunice Ross herself, with this heartrending petition saying that she was denied access to schooling on account of her color, finally bringing the total of signatures in support of the measure to 356. These petitions, however, were answered with petitions asking for no action to be taken on the basis that the African school was enough, handily ignoring the fact that it did not continue past the 8th grade. Those petitions numbered 350 signatures, just 6 less than the petitions in support. The legislature ultimately agreed with Pompey and Boston, who then had to sue the town, and the schools were finally integrated in 1846. It's not recorded that Eunice Ross ever attended high school in the end, but Absalom Boston's daughter, Phoebe Ann, did and completed her education there. African heritage people continued to live, work, and play on Nantucket through the decades. The Carter family gifted us a wonderful group of photos of their summer pleasures in the village of Sconset. A notable successful businesswoman from the turn of the century was Florence Clay Higginbotham, shown here as a young woman sailing with Edward Starbuck, one of the founders of the NHA, and later in her fancy dress. She eventually purchased both the African Meeting House and the ancestral home of the Boston family next door, and donated them both to the Museum of African American History in Boston, which owns them today. Life is a bit easier now than it was in 1820, with fewer people starving, better access to education and healthcare, and better working conditions. Yet today, Nantucket's economy is powered almost entirely by seasonal visitors and absentee owners of second homes. The year-round community survives by servicing the summer folks. The island is still highly racially stratified, with a large community of Jamaican, Nepali, Bulgarian, and Cape Verdean workers, among many other groups, working in service of the summer community, mainly very wealthy white families. The service workers are paid very well by mainland standards. Many have built thriving and even lucrative businesses, and there's always work available, but the cost of living is high, and life on the island is, well, complicated. The artificial barriers of race that have been erected and maintained through the many years and centuries have been extremely tough to bring down. We fight them still. Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak with you. I'll be available for conversation after this video, and I hope you've all brought questions.
Hi, I want to introduce myself. I'm Abby. I'm the communications manager at the Big Reed Lakeshore. Thank you so much for preparing that presentation for us, Dan. It was so interesting that you mentioned Skip Finley, because we actually have an event coming up with him on the 11th. It'll be a Q&A with him. So check out our website if you guys are interested in that. We're now going to transition into a Q&A. Our first question is, did the Nantucketers invent whaling? If not, who did and when?
Good question. The Nantucketers did not invent whaling. Alaska Native people and Native people in New England and elsewhere have been whaling for millennia. Inuit people in Greenland. There have been many thousands of years of technological development and whaling by indigenous people. And in fact, even European and European American whaling had been going on for several centuries by the time Nantucket whaling was developed. Nantucketers were the first really to build try works on the ship and built essentially factory ships that could go out for years at a time and bring whale oil back from anywhere on the globe. That was the big innovation in Nantucket whaling.
Would you say that the Nantucketers were some of the most efficient whalers?
They absolutely, from an economic perspective, they absolutely were the most efficient. As I noted in the presentation, the competitors in England and France were paid flat wages, and the introduction of the lay system, essentially similar to how venture capitalists fund risky software ventures now, by giving a share of the profits to the programmers. This was an early instance of that kind of venture capital funding, and the sailors, the whalers, really responded. They whaled. They caught. Nantucket was 50% of the American market of whale oil. Provided
Wow.
50% of the American market for whale oil, and the American market for whale oil was 70% of the international market. So from one small island with a population of less than 4,000 or 5,000 people, 35% of the world market in whale oil was supplied.
That is so interesting, especially because Nantucket's quite a small island.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so you talked about race, early history on race in Nantucket. What is it like now?
I mentioned at the end of the talk a little bit about the current status of Nantucket. Nantucket is a happy community. It's a great place for many people, but the racial makeup is still quite stratified. There are a large number of Jamaican people, of Cape Verdean people, people from Nepal, from different countries around the world who make their homes now and their livings on Nantucket. But those are not the wealthy summer people. The summer people tend to be very strongly white and very wealthy. It's a typical resort community in that way.
Thank you for that answer. The next question is, did anyone resist the shift to Quakerism on Nantucket, considering they went to Nantucket for religious freedom in the first place?
Interesting question. I would say that by the time that Mary Starbuck began to spread the Quaker religion on Nantucket, there was not a great deal of resistance among the English, because at that time, of course, all the European heritage people were in fact subjects of the crown. The English adopted Quakerism fairly completely. The local indigenous people, the Wampanoag people, some of them adopted Quakerism, adopted Christianity. Some of them did not. But the maintenance of religious freedom was not the primary driver in people's decision-making about whether or not to convert to Quakerism. I think it was really largely a matter of peer pressure and wanting to be kind of in the core group of culture.
Interesting. All right, the next question is, what was life like for the Nantucketers of color around when the Essex set sail? So more from the point of view of the Nantucketers of color.
Yeah. Nantucketers, well, I'm not very well placed to make a categorical statement about that, but it's my impression that Nantucketers of color had more opportunity than people of color in many parts of the mainland to become independent business people, landowners, property owners, innkeepers, business owners of various kinds. The antipathy to slavery had become fairly well entrenched in Nantucket by that time. And the lay system did allow African-American whalers to accumulate capital and make their own lives. The people who were whaling captains, African-American whaling captains, like Edward J. Pompey and Absalom Boston, were able to translate that success into landside success when they retired from the sea. And the New Guinea community was, a functioning economic community. It was not as wealthy as the Quaker community, but it did have opportunity for individuals. So I think the situation was not as bad as it was in many places. But again, there was not a special school for African children until 1820 or 25. And that meant that the African children probably didn't get much education, although there was a man named Cyrus Pierce pretty early in the 19th century who believed on Nantucket, an educator who believed that all children should be educated equally. And so there was opportunity for education for children as well.
All right, so with that, were the opportunities that Nantucketers of color had, would that have been different or possible had Nantucket not been an island?
A very interesting question. Nantucket is 30 miles out to sea. It's one of the most distant major islands off the United States, the contiguous United States. I think it's the 5th largest island and one of the furthest offshore. And you have to think about what the dynamics of transportation were like at that time. Ships were much better transport devices at that time than any land transportation. Carriages, riding horses, walking were really the options on land. So Nantucket in the 1820s was, I'm fond of saying, it was like the Vincent J. Lombardi rest stop on the New Jersey Thruway. It was right in the middle of the major shipping lanes on up and down the East Coast. Mm-hmm. Later, as rail began to be more important, it became less so. But Nantucket did provide an opportunity for African Americans to be at a distance from the slave catchers who were operating throughout the country, pursuant to the Fugitive Slave Acts passed in 1793 and then again in 1840s, I believe. So they could hide more effectively on Nantucket than they could, say, in New Bedford or in other ports.
All right, thank you for that answer. Our next question comes from Paul. He asks, Dan, can you talk a little more about how Massachusetts courts made slavery impractical?
Yeah, it's a great question. Massachusetts courts, to the best of my knowledge, and certainly I'm not a legal historian, but the Massachusetts courts made slavery untenable by finding in favor of slaves who sued for back wages. There was a case on Nantucket of a captain, not a slave, but a captain who had paid a lay to Prince Boston, who was the uncle of Absalom Boston. Prince Boston was a slave, and he was sent on a whaling voyage by his master. When he returned from the whaling voyage, the master had died, and he applied to the captain for his lay, which was his share of the profits from the voyage. The captain awarded him that lay, and then was sued by the heirs of William Swain. That case became a precedent. The courts found in favor of the captain and allowed him to pay the wages to Prince Boston directly. That case became a precedent. And then later on in Western Massachusetts, there's a very famous case of a female slave. I'm drawing a blank on her name, I apologize. But she sued for back wages as a slave and was found for in the 1780s. And a number of cases came together at that time and were resolved by the courts all at once. And she became really the flag bearer for laws, the change in laws in Massachusetts that allowed slaves to be paid for their service. And so it quickly became impracticable in Massachusetts to be a slave owner, because the courts would find against you if your slaves sued you. Massachusetts never passed a law against slavery until the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in the middle of the 19th century.
Thank you for that answer.
Yeah.
Our next question comes from our social media manager, Kylie Galloway. She asks, how can we amplify the discussion of race on Nantucket as we discuss In the Heart of the Sea this year? Do you recommend any specific resources?
That's a really good question. There is a book that has recently been published by the Nantucket Historical Association about Anna Gardner. It's called Disturber of Tradition. And her work in the African community, both on Nantucket and in North Carolina, before and during the Civil War, is really inspiring. There is also a resource on, it's a resource at Harvard. The Harvard libraries have made a resource which contains all of the petitions that were signed for and against educating African heritage children on Nantucket. It's accessible through Mass Historical Society and the state archives, which is where those documents rest. But that's a great kind of primary source resource for viewing the nature of the conflict on Nantucket. I referred to a number of different tracts and early writings about slavery on Nantucket in the talk. If you go back, there is enough information there that you can go and find those items online. They're all, the full text is available in one resource or another.
Well, great. I will look for those resources so that we can send them out to our readers. You mentioned Frederick Douglass in your talk, which I found very interesting because I actually came across him when I was doing my research for this year's program. Can we find any of his lectures? Is that another resource that we can find? At
the NHA's website, nha.org, you can search the collection, and if you look for Frederick Douglass on that site, we have I posted both the transcript and also Frederick Douglass's autograph copy of a eulogy that he gave for a man on Nantucket, David Joy, who was an abolitionist, a white Quaker abolitionist. There are all of Frederick Douglass's books are available in PDF form on I think, Library of Congress. I can hook you up with that information as well. But all of Frederick Douglass's own writings about his life as a slave and his work in abolition are available for free on the web.
Well, I will definitely look into those.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having that Q&A with us, letting us pick your brain on a topic that's very important right now.
Yeah, it's absolutely important. And it's been a privilege and a pleasure for me to be able to do some of the digging and find some of the information available to you. I should mention that there is in Boston, the Museum of African American History and Culture, African American Art and History. Yes, I think it's MAAH. And they currently own the African Meeting House on Nantucket and the house next door, which was the Boston family's, their ancestral home. And the Museum of African American Art and History is an extraordinary organization. There are great resources there as well to find out about African American lives in Massachusetts and particularly on Nantucket.
That's some good information. Thank you for that.
Good. All right. It's been a great pleasure. And thank you guys so much. It's really been fun working with you.
It's been great. Thank you so much for that talk. And then to our viewers watching, don't forget to check out our website. We still have a lot of events this year. Total, we have 53 events. So make sure to check those out, including a Q&A with Skip Finley on the 11th. And thank you again for Dan for preparing those amazing questions. We hope to see you guys at our next event.